my guest tonight, Sashi Perera, comedian and lawyer. Hi, Sashi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Absolutely. I wore neon green especially for you.
I'm so pleased that you did that. That is just an amazing color.
Sashi, thank you for doing the show. You live and work in Australia. You're originally from Sri Lanka. You have the benefit of having dual perspectives on life. How does this shape your brand of comedy?
I think it's a great benefit sometimes, a little bit of a curse sometimes too, because you're kind of caught between two worlds, which is a very common migrant story, I think. I think it's particularly different because I was born here and then we moved when I was 1. So a lot of the Sri Lankan culture that I've learned has been outside Sri Lanka. So trying to marry the two has been very interesting. And I think a lot of my comedy, especially with the show this year, it's called Boundaries, it's trying to figure out how much of Sri Lankan culture and how much of Australian culture to take with me into me, if that makes sense.
Sure. I've had the benefit of watching your comedy, Sashi, and you delve into the nuances of Sri Lankan culture and how at times it's comedic, how at times it can be toxic. Speak to us about how you pick on those.
I think I really want to highlight both the positives and the negatives of living in any community. And the thing with the Sri Lankan community is what I've realized is it's a collectivist culture, which means that it's not about the individual, it's the community that it's all about. And there is something very beautiful in that, but also sometimes you want space for yourself and you don't get it. And I love talking about the conflicts that happen as a result of that. So I think for me, especially growing up, for a lot of us growing up, I think we needed a bit of space sometimes, and that is something you're not allowed to ask for. And I'm still learning how to ask for that. I think, oh my gosh, I'm scared that I've made some aunties angry back home now already. Yeah.
For the Sri Lankan parents watching us, they might be wondering, what are boundaries?
Oh my gosh. I
Take
just
us through some of...
Okay, so obviously this was from a white therapist in Australia when I said, I'm having a bit of trouble. My parents got divorced and I said, I'm having a bit of trouble navigating this divorce. And she told me about boundaries, and she taught me about firm boundaries, draw a circle around yourself and maintain a healthy distance from which to love your family. And this was one of my favorite jokes. I said I grew up with boundaries where it's the same circle, but everyone from the island of Sri Lanka is inside it. And it's a very difficult thing to tell your parents that you need a bit of space. I am still learning that in my 3rd decade of life. So I can imagine there are some Sri Lankan parents back home just thinking, this lady is outrageous.
Sashi, your comedy delves into the quirks and idiosyncrasies of everyday life. How do you find magic in the mundane?
I thought the comedy, when I started, I very much didn't want to talk about being a woman. I didn't want to talk about being Sri Lankan. I wanted to keep it to things that everyone could relate to. So I would talk about doors, or I would talk about self-serve checkouts or crows, just the mundane, everyday things. But I found that the more I talked about the things that I was personally experiencing, the more I was connecting with the audience. So that really taught me some great things about the kind of comedy that people really relate to. So I still do talk about the mundane. I think there is so much you can talk about, just everyday things, even doors. Doors are bananas if you think about it. The push-pull on the doors, whether it's a push or a pull.
I never get it right.
No one does. There's a 50% chance of getting it right. And just thinking about those things always makes me happy. But I'm discovering a mix of everything is really resonating with my audience, which is lovely.
Sashi, something that I've noticed about your comedy is that you always try to lift people up, and you're a kind comedian. How can you be kind and funny at the same time?
You would be surprised at how many people are offended by my jokes.
Oh.
Yeah, I really think it is kind of the lightest form of humor, but there are still, online, there are a lot of people on the internet, and I am finding no matter what I joke about, someone will always be offended by it. But I try not to, you were at the show, I try not to roast anyone in the audience. I'm trying to have an actual comment. When I ask a question, I really want to engage. I want to know what their answer is. They're never going to be the butt of the joke because, life's tough enough. Like, we're all walking around with so much on our shoulders. You don't want to come to a comedy show and be made fun of. I don't think so. Yeah, I try very much to just keep it light.
Mm-hmm. Sashi, comedy is said to be a reflection of society. Do you think this is so? Because if so, we're living in very tough times around the world. We see so much of conflict, so much of harm and hurt. What's the role of comedy in an increasingly fragmented world?
I think different comedians have different types of comedy, and I think particularly my comedy, I used to be a refugee lawyer, so I was a refugee lawyer for 10 years. I worked in many different countries in conflict situations, and I think once I came to the end of that, so I did 10 years of that, and then when I started comedy, I very much wanted to steer completely away from it. Sure. So I think that there are political comedians who have very good satirical comedians. They have great political satire about the world as it is. But for me, I wanted to steer completely away from it and kind of be like, okay, it's kind of crazy out there, but in this bubble, let's just laugh. So I think I try to poke fun of just everyday things, being a woman, being Sri Lankan, but I do try to leave the conflicts at the door. But one of the worst heckles I ever got actually was on a Friday night in a packed comedy club, and I'd been talking about religion, and a man put his hand up and said, well, what do you think about the Gaza situation? And I just, it was like, we're at a comedy show. We're not going to talk about Gaza here because we're probably not going to solve it at a comedy show. Yeah.
Yeah. So you worked for 10 years as a refugee lawyer. How did that sort of influence your decision to become a comedian?
I think I really needed to laugh after 10 years. I think especially in Australia, the policies got more and more and more strict. It became much harder to work in the area with the increasingly bad policies that the government was bringing in. And also when I was working overseas, so I worked in Tanzania, I worked in Egypt, I worked in a number of other places, and it was just such a huge issue. I felt like I was this cog in this system that was constantly grinding. I think only 1% of, I think the statistic is only 1% of refugees in the world are resettled. So the numbers are staggering. And I think after 10 years of doing that, I thought, okay, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to try my hand at comedy. And I never expected it to go this far. And I always intended to go back to it. But I think I'm slowly realizing I don't think I'm going to go back. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We are in conversation with comedian Sashi Perera. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
Presidential election has to be held because unlike local government election and some other elections that was postponed, presidential election is very clearly stated in the constitution with the dates.
It is the future, it is the present, the composition of the present and the way how we are building up for it to get into the future.
Nothing to declare in terms of the constitution. You have to have the presidential election this year. In their propagandas, the first priority they have been given to abolish the executive because there was a public demand.
Because these government policies, I think, are not going to solve our problem. And also, the political henchmen are still running these agents.
On the areas where we can thrive through collaboration rather than competing with India.
Streaming live on Newsfirst, YouTube and Facebook channels.
බින්දුවටම ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කරපු සමහර දේශපාලන ප්‍රවාහයන් ආයෙනවා කලාව නාව. ඒකෙත් කලාවක් තියෙනවා. ඒක කලාව. ඒ මොකක්ද? කොහොමද ඒක කියවන්නේ? තරුණයෝ ඉල්ලුවේ සිස්ටම් චේන්ජ් එක. ඒක උනේ නෑනේ.
ඒක හදන්න මිනිස්සු ඉන්නව නැත්තේ නෑ.
IMF එකෙන් ණය ගත්ත හැකි. ඔව්. ආර්ථික කඩාවැටීම. මේ සංස්කෘතික කඩාවැටීම සිදු වුණාන් පස්සේ අපි කාගෙන්ද ණයට ගන්න කියන ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙනවා.
හරි කරගෙන කාට හරි ගේමක් දීලා කීයක් හරි හොයාගෙන ඉන්න නම් පුරුෂාර්ථය හැදිලා තියෙන ජීවිතේ එතනින් එහාට යගේ හියුමන් ලයිෆ් එකේ ගමනක් නෑනේ.
මිනිස්සු ප්ලෑන් කරපු ජීවිත නැති වෙලා හැමෝටම තමන්ගේ ජීවිතය අහිමි.
ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ දරිද්‍රතාවයක් කියනවා. Poverty of democracy. බුද්ධිමය සංවාදය බ්‍රහස්පතින්දා රාත්‍රී 10:30 මාවත.
අම්මා නැති හින්දා අම්මගේ තාත්තගේ දෙන්නගම යුතුයකම් මට දැන් ඉෂ්ට කරන්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ.
අභිමන්ට ඔය විදිහ දෛවයක් කුරුම කරලා දෙන්න බෑ. එයාට ඕනේ එතනින් මිදෙන අලුත් ජීවිතයක් පටන් ගන්න.
රොයිත්ගේ තරම මොකද්ද කියලා ඔබට තව වැඩි කාලයක් යන ඉස්සෙල්ලා තේරෙයි. බලපන් මම උඹේ කට වහන්නේ.
තව කොයි කාලයක් නම් බයෙන් ඉන්නද? දැන් මෙහෙම හිටියා ඇතිනේ. ඔය අහලා තියෙනවද කුල්ලු කතාවක්? විෂෙන් විෂ නැසේ කියලා.
අපේ පූජා මේ කරන වැඩේ තේරුම ඈ. එයි මේ වකකීමක් නැතුව වැඩ කරන්නේ.
ඇයි මේ පූජාවයි අභිමන්වයි එකතු කරන්න හදන්නේ?
විශාඛා කවුද ඒ දෙන්නව එකතු කරන්න හැදුවේ?
මම ජීවිතේ හොඳට එන්ජොයි කරපු එන්ජොයි කරන්න දන්න ගෑණි.
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ විදිහට අපි ගොඩද?
මේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති රාමුවත් මේකත් හිස් වූ රාමුවක්.
නායකෙක්ට පුළුවන් අවශ්‍යයි නම් සංවේදීත් වෙලා ඒ වෙලාවෙම තාර්කිකත් වෙන්න.
ජානමය හේතුත් බලපාන්න පුළුවන් ද සමහර වෙලාවට මානසික තත්ත්ව වෙනස් වෙන්න.
මානසික රෝගයක් 80%ක් ජානගතයි. 20%ක් එන්වයරන්මන්ට් එකේ ඉන්නේ.
නින්දෙදිත් සිදුවෙන ශ්වසන අපහසුතාවන් පිළිබඳ අපිට වාර්තා වෙනවා. මේක ගොරවනකොට වැඩි වෙනවද?
නින්දේදී සිදුවන ශ්වසන අවහිරතාවය නැත්නම් මේක හඳුන්වනවා මේ ඔබ්ස්ට්‍රක්ටිව් ස්ලීප් ඇප්නියා කියන තත්ත්වය.
ජාතික මෙහෙවර සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 11ට.
මගේ සීන නොවේද
අපිට කවදාවත් පිරිසිදු වතුර තිබුණේ නැහැ බොන්න. අපේ දරුවන්ටත් පිරිසිදු වතුර නැහැ බොන්න. හැමදාමත් අපේ ගම්වල පිරිසිදු වතුර නැතිව හැදෙන රෝග වැඩි. හැබැයි අදින් පස්සේ අම්පාර නාවින්න උනාපාන අපේ දරුවන්ට හොඳ අනාගතයක් ලැබේවි. මේ ලැබුණු ජල පිරණයත් එක්ක ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජන පෞර. TV1 TV for life. Electricity tariff reduced by 21.9% effective from midnight today. Unit rate reduced from 12 rupees to 8 rupees for consumers using less than 30 units. 8 of the 56 Sri Lankans held at a cyber slave camp in Myanmar rescued. Parliament passes 42 new laws over the last 14 months to transform the economy. 62 additional laws to be presented to Parliament. President comments on what will happen if anyone attempts to impede these efforts. No confidence motion against the Speaker to be tabled in Parliament tomorrow. SLPP chief organizer to arrive in Sri Lanka tomorrow. Basil is not coming back to Sri Lanka to wash Ranil's laundry, says Rajapaksa confidant Udayanga Veeratunga. A new institution to integrate the Indo-Sri Lanka power transmission systems. The cost is $1.2 billion.
TV1 TV for life.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. You're watching The People's Platform. We are in conversation with comedian Sashi Perera. Sashi, in Sri Lankan society, marriage is a huge cultural, societal obligation, especially cast on Sri Lankan women. You deal with this aspect in your comedy. Talk to us about it.
I do. It, it was a huge thing where I think from the time you're born till the time you finish your education, you can't look at a boy, you can't date. And then suddenly you're expected to get married very shortly after. And you kind of think like, to who? I haven't been talking to anyone. So I think for me, marriage was always kind of that expectation. I was a bridesmaid to a lot of cousins here, and Sri Lankan weddings are massive, right? Like everything's so beautiful, everything's so over the top. Sometimes there's an elephant. Are people still doing that? That was a thing. That was a real thing. And I was engaged to a very lovely Sri Lankan man, and we were supposed to get married at Mount Lavinia, and 2 months before the wedding we cancelled it, and it was a huge debacle, obviously. And I didn't think I'd get married after that. I thought, there's always this thing of, you're too old, you've ruined your one chance with this very nice man. And I think everything in my first show, it was called Endings, and it was finding your way through that. Understanding that it's never too late, and there's not necessarily one person for everyone, and you don't have to get married just because everyone tells you to. And I'm now married to a very nice man who is a white Australian, and I think that would have been a real problem before 30. I think there would have been a lot of, who is he, who is his family, what does he do, all of that. But after 30, it's just, please, anyone is fine. Like anyone is fine. So I think the pressure really decreases the longer you leave it, it seems to be.
What is the message for people listening, watching this interview tonight? Because sometimes cultural norms are blindly followed. We don't even question why we're doing things a certain way, even though they may be toxic to us or harmful to us, right?
Yeah, I think it took me a long time to learn what I wanted, and I think that again comes back to the collectivist society, right? Like you live in a community, you do as everyone else does, and that's fine as long as that works for you. And for whatever reason, it didn't work for me, and I really needed to figure out what it is that I wanted, not just from myself, from my life, from a partner. And I didn't actually know that. I just kind of met someone really nice, and the next step was getting married and then having kids and doing all of those things. And when I took a second to be like, do I actually want this? The answer was no. And that was really awkward, and I wish I had come to that conclusion much earlier and handled everything better. But I think the message is, make sure that you're doing it because you want to, not because everyone around you thinks you should or you saw everyone else doing it.
So we need to move away from blindly being conformist?
I think so. Like, it's hard though, because it works for a lot of people. Like, it worked for a lot of my friends who are very happy with their husbands that they married much younger. And I think it's as long as you are consciously making those decisions, you're actively participating in where your life is going. And I think for a lot of women, that's very hard sometimes to put their foot down, to speak for what they want. And I think that's something that we're all learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sri Lankans aren't that great at conflict resolution as well, which is also something that you've picked up on in your comedy. Speak to us about some of that.
Okay, I have to try very hard not to get in trouble here because my mum is watching. But I don't know if your parents were like this, but my parents, we didn't really talk about anything. So I have this joke where I say conflict resolution in my house was, there was an issue, we would blow up at each other, and then we wouldn't speak to each other for like 2 to 6 business days. And then we just go on as if nothing happened. So there was a lot of things that was consistently being swept under the rug. And I'm starting to talk about this more because I'm starting to get more comfortable about talking about it's really harmful, because you have to be able to sit and talk about an issue, apologize to each other, figure out what you can do to move on. But I think, they say about parents and children, parents just want to thank you and children just want a sorry. And for a lot of our lives we don't give that to each other, and yeah, it's something that I'm still trying to work through. What was your family like? Did you actually talk about things, or did you sweep everything under the rug?
No, we actually did. The communication was pretty good, actually.
That's amazing.
Touch wood. Yeah.
No wonder you're doing this right now. You're great at communicating.
Thank you.
But no, I do talk about it just because as a result of, I think, that mode of communication and that mode of conflict resolution, I didn't actually know how to raise issues in my relationships, and I didn't know how to resolve issues in that relationship. So I think it's helped me a lot learning how to communicate, and I'm still not good at it. Sometimes I don't know if I'm sad or hungry, you know, and you should be able to identify that basic difference. I'm getting much better at it with some counselling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is where therapy comes in.
You know, they say therapy is for white people, but therapy is for everyone.
Therapy is for everyone.
It's really genuinely quite helpful having an independent human look at your life and think, you know, offer you some basics for working through things.
Of course. And I think, Sashi, if there's one message that we can communicate to our audience, it should be the importance of therapy, because therapy is at times demonized, especially for men.
Especially for men. And I think more and more people are realizing how important mental health is. I think they are realizing that it's as important as physical health. We are now recognizing, you know, in our parents' generation, there is a lot that was swept under the rug. A lot of anxiety, depression, substance abuse issues, things that were never really talked about that have been passed down, and a lot of intergenerational trauma.
Of course.
And I remember my dad, he's passed away, unfortunately, and he would talk to me about anger, you know, with conflict resolution going from 0 to 100, and he would say, you've got to break the cycle. You have to break the cycle. Like, this ends with you. And I thought, well, my ancestors just got to walk around really mad, and I have to, to sort this out. Okay, thank you. But it's helped. It's helped. And for Charlie, my husband, he comes from a completely different culture where you don't go from 0 to 100. And, you know, they have their own issues, but conflict resolution in this particular case isn't that. So I think I had to learn how to talk to him in a healthier way about things that I was upset about. And counselling as a result has been very helpful with that.
Of course. We see comedy being used as activism. Recently, we also saw comedians getting arrested in Sri Lanka. Should we resort to self-censorship, or what really should be done? How do you view this?
I think there's a huge conversation happening in comedy, particularly at the moment, about what's on, what can be made fun of, what can't be made fun of, how far is too far. I was watching the Natasha Eduri-Surya case very closely last year because, well, in Australia you can't get arrested for a bad joke because the prisons would be full. You know, like, it would cost the state far too much money. You can't put comedians in jail. And I think I found that very interesting because of the content, and I think that's that extra layer that you've got to be careful about when you're performing in certain countries. What is okay in one country will not be okay in another. And you were at the show. I took out anything that could be mildly perceived as religious material, political material, sex content, and so I really self-censored myself, but that was really to avoid any potential issues for me or the venue or my family. My family was very stressed. They said, don't do a show there. And I said, no, you just have to understand the environment that you're operating in. And while it may be unfair, it is the one that we're currently in, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I mean, having said that, it is important that we see ourselves in a lighter vein, that we can actually laugh at ourselves.
Yeah, you would hope so. And this is the thing with comedy, because, you know, sometimes comedians go viral. Normally they're white men and they've made a joke about trans people or trans kids or domestic violence or sexual assault, and people say, like, how can you still be joking about that? And most of the time it's not even the material, it's that it's a bad joke, you know. But even if they made it in a good way, it's like, well, isn't there other things that you can be talking about? I find it very odd that we have so much focus on material of comedians and not as much on people who are actually in public life and active in politics. Or it's very odd, the complete fire that comedians are coming under these days. Like Hassan Minhaj is a very good other example. I'm not sure if you know what happened to him with the New Yorker, but they fact-checked a whole bunch of his jokes and they said, you know, these are lies, essentially, a whole portion of his stand-up comedy, and that had never happened to any comedian previously. And you know, he didn't go to jail, but I feel like he went to comedy jail, you know,
like he was kind of cancelled, right?
Yeah, he was cancelled for emotional truths. And yeah, there is a real spotlight on comedians at the moment and their material.
Let's also talk about the subject matter of comedians when it comes to people in powerful positions, for example, people in government office. There is a stark difference when making jokes when in the West as opposed to making jokes at a political leader when in countries such as Sri Lanka. How do you see this difference?
It's a very stark difference. I think especially in Australia, anything is up for grabs. And if anything, we have no respect for our elected officials. I don't know if that's a good thing, but kind of anything really is up for grabs for me personally, because I still work as a lawyer in Australia and I work for the state government. So I keep those two things very separate, and I try not to speak about politics because we're supposed to be apolitical. And so I don't have any political content which relates to anyone in the leadership in Australia at state or federal level, but I know many comedians that do, and they are completely unscathed in the material. That I think it's important to be able to make fun of everything, because we are all dealing with something, and once you start taking certain things off the table, it kind of leaves the things that you can joke about, the margin for it gets narrower and narrower. Yeah.
Sashi, my final question, what next for Sashi Perera?
Well, it's very exciting. So I had my first show in Colombo here. I'll be back with way more shows hopefully next year. But everything kicks off with Melbourne Comedy Festival. So I'm going on tour around Australia, then to the UK, and I can't wait. I'm very nervous, but very excited.
Fabulous. Looking forward to seeing you at your comedy show hopefully soon.
Yes.
Thanks, Sashi. This was lovely.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.